Ahora, por el mismo razonamiento, habría que eliminar el Teatro Colón, habría que eliminar el Paseo Colón, habría que cambiar el nombre de Colombia. Ya lo tiene el Centro Cultural. No, echaron, pero se la verdad. Y eso como las Malvinas. Eso le va a dar a los peronistas así una... Es lo bueno, la buena indicación.
We'll solve it today. I'm joking a little bit, but...
Good afternoon. I was asking if Conchita would remain there, but we have Torres-García with us. Welcome to you all to this symposium. My name is Luis Pérez-Oramas, and I had the privilege of curating the exhibition that gathers us today here, Joaquín Torres-García, the Arcadian Modern. I curated this show alongside Karen Grimson, curatorial assistant, and with the key contributions of Janine Guimaraes, former curatorial assistant, and lately with the assistance of Catalina Acosta Carrizos, and I want to thank you them because it's been a wonderful team, and they are very much the ones who have been making all this possible. And I would like to welcome you all. And also I would like to thank the Education Department here at MoMA, who helped us organizing these 2 days of reflections and conversations around Torres. First, I think it's a unique opportunity and for us here at the museum, for the audience, and for all who have been interested in his work and legacy. Then I want to thank you, our speakers and guests, who truly don't need introduction, so I won't be here reading their biographies that you have in the program, who have generously accepted our invitation to spark this conversation on Torres-García, his oeuvre, his achievements, his contradictions, his legacy. We have divided this event into 2 sections. One will be devoted to the general theme, sparking suggestion, I hope, modernity of the South. And that will be addressed from 3 different perspectives, by Estrella de Diego, Jorge Schwartz, and Niko Vicario. Estrella will certainly bring her acute and fecund observation of critically important margins of modernity, margins of modernism, and also her extensible knowledge of Latin American and Spanish modernity, especially when it comes to figures and notably women artists, that the canonical narrative or the canonical narratives, and I think it's a plural fact, of modernism resist to integrate. Jorge Schwartz is a major specialist on literary avant-gardes in Latin America, both literature and visual arts, and I think that we all who have dealt with that issue feel like we are students of Jorge Schwartz. He is a major thinker and writer about those issues, and he is also the director of the museum Lasar Segall in Sao Paulo. And I am sure that he, being both Argentinian and Brazilian, he will be able to bridge these 2 continents, these 2 places, these 2 constituents of Latin America where Torres' legacy has been felt more strikingly, and also the 2 worlds of painting and literature. And finally, Niko Vicario has been advancing on a research on the material history of Latin American modernism and the global geopolitics of art materials, which I think will be compelling to listen to, particularly vis-a-vis Torres' own work, on whose archives in Montevideo Niko has spent time researching, and that was there that we first met a year and a half ago. So what we have asked them to do is to produce a very short argument between 10 and 15 minutes, maybe in the form of questions, and then I hope we will be having a conversation among us and with you all. After that first part, after the break, I will invite to the podium, I don't know if this is a podium, to this plays. My friends Luis Camnitzer and Maria Gough. Luis is an artist, a leading practitioner and theoretician of conceptual art and a radical thinker about the function of art vis-a-vis its educational resonance. Let's put it that way. Certainly I am doing wrong, but we all know and admire his oeuvre and praise also his commitment to always being bluntly honest when expressing his views. But I invited Luis because he is Uruguayan. He was born in Uruguay. And an artist who never fell under the shadow of Torres, but I suspected had to deal with the legacy of Torres, at least intellectually, in his native country. A legacy that is as rich as it is complex, and that I think really requires careful criticism today. Critical elaboration. Luis will tell us better than anyone else, I think, will be able to do, to what extent some of the contradictions that I was referring before among the legacy of Torres take place between the work that Torres produced and the national legacy that was produced after Torres. Finally, Maria Gough, and I am extremely glad and happy that she's with us. Maria is not a specialist on Latin American art, neither Torres-García, but truly, I think her landmark investigations and books on Russian constructivism have truly changed the nature of the conversation about constructivism itself and about the many extensions of the constructivist legacy, certainly for me. Maria's work changed my entire understanding of Russian avant-garde, and I think that we all be enlightened by having her addressing what I call the uses and abuses. Probably she's just going to address the uses of the term constructivism, notably during the 20s and 30s and on specific cases, which is the period that is most critically important for Torres' production. Therefore, I hope sparking also a conversation on the potentialities and limitations of the term construction, which, as we know, was key for Torres and continues to be a major reference within those who discuss his legacy and within those who discuss the continent, the artistic continent, the artistic constellations that might be linked to his legacy. Some years ago, I published an essay on one of those newspapers that usually are printed for the Documenta, in Documenta 10, Documenta Castle, and that was titled, "Does a Modernity of the South Exist?" And it was kind of a provocation as a question. On that essay that I have been trying to find and just have the recollection, rather baroque thing that I wrote at the time with a coda on one of the greatest popular singers in Latin America, Bola de Nieve, Snowball, a gay black genius. I suggested that the idea of a modernity of the South was a fictitious concept. But a fictitious concept in the sense in which Ludwig Wittgenstein would say that nothing is more important than fictitious concepts which will help us understand our real ones. Fictitious or not, the various modernities that took place south of this dominant nation seem to resist to being assimilated into the narratives of an art historical fairy tale that still insists, notably and frequently in this very own institution, on inserting art singularities into the general categories of a history that is only that of the art produced in the North American East Coast during the second half of the 20th century. And I think that we who are working here on these topics and these problems are very much confronting and questioning that fact and trying to argue for an understanding of the singularities of the various modernities that took place in Latin America. That is why, fictitious or not, the expression of a will to place the South as our North and the image of this inverted map of South America continues to be relevant, or at least exciting. So this being said, I will invite here Estrella, Jorge, and Niko. I'll be with you so you don't feel alone there. And then after the break, we'll continue with Luis and Maria. And I hope that you will have plenty of questions and that we have time to address them. Thank you very much.
Yeah, because it's going to be difficult not to say them, right? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Luis, for this kind invitation, and of course, thank you to the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And of course, I would like to thank you all for being with us this afternoon. Well, being here today, giving a presentation at MoMA, it's a great honor and a pleasure for me because I think MoMA's museum, and I'm not saying anything new at all, is one of the best in the world. It's like, I was joking with Luis before, it's like the Prado of modern art, is because he said, I mean, he was very intimidated at the Prado, and I'm very intimidated at MoMA, especially, with this very important colleagues who are here with us today. Of course, that's very good collection includes the Latin American art collection, which is full of lots of great works, which haven't always been placed in the right place. And this is what I would like to discuss today, among other things. In this respect, I would like to start my presentation quoting a short but very incisive piece by poet and writer John Yao. I'm sure lots of you are familiar with him. And the article was published in December 1988, so very many years ago. Things have changed a lot, of course, in Arts Magazine, if I'm not wrong. And the title sounds quite revealing. Please wait by the courtroom. Gerardo Mosquera drew my attention to this article, and I want to thank him when we were discussing Wilfredo Lam. In fact, Yao's text was referring to this work, The Jungle, here at MoMA Museum, by Cuban artist Wilfredo Lam, now considered one of the top works at MoMA, I think I would say, and for most scholars, the painter's masterpiece, whatever masterpiece may be in this context I would like to discuss today. So let me quote the beginning of Yao's article. Wilfredo Lam's The Jungle hangs in the hallway leading to the courtroom of the Museum of Modern Art. Its location is telling. The artist has been allowed to the museum lobby, but like a delivery boy, has been made to wait in a passageway near the front door. By denying Lam the possibility of going upstairs and conversing with Paul Cézanne, Pablo Picasso, Jackson Pollock, and Frank Stella, the works are carefully arranged on the walls of the main galleries, the museum relegates The Jungle to a secondary status. End quote. Lam had returned to Cuba from Europe in 1941, 2 years before The Jungle was actually painting, and it was in Europe where he actually met Picasso and got familiar with Matisse and Cézanne, as the most common story often tells. But most important, in Europe, in Paris to be more precise, Lam became fully conscious of his Cuban origins, partly due to his friendship with Martinique artist Aimé Césaire. This is Lam, and this is Aimé Césaire, that you all know, who codified the term négritude, as you all know, blackness. And as you remember, black was very fashionable in Paris at that time. I have taken a few examples here. This is of course, Baker. And as I said, black was a hot issue in Paris during those years, even a fashionable issue among white, elegant ladies. They were using in their hair this Baker fix, which is a kind of a contradiction, because why it's not working? Okay, this is of course Niki, and you know, she's using Baker fix too, and it was like something very common among jet setters in Paris at that time. This is Nancy Cunard, the famous Negrophile. Of course, la négritude was made into a commodity, and is very different, of course, from Lam's conception at that time. Lam was not only the Cuban expatriate who felt fully Cuban in Paris. Another interesting character, Lidia Cabrera, a Cuban writer and anthropologist in Lam's circle, rediscovered Cuba in Paris too, partly after completing her studies in Oriental art at l'École de Louvre, that rose her interest in how much Cuban national identity was influenced by African culture, as she says. As she explains, quote, I studied Eastern religion and cultures. I was deeply interested in these studies. Later, they would lead me to what is ours. When I returned to Cuba for 2 months in 1928, I already felt a strong desire to spend times with blackness. I had discovered Cuban on the shores of Paris, end quote. Besides, her friend, Teresa de la Parra, a Venezuelan artist I'm sure Luis knows very well, was very involved with folklore and origins of her own country, and she also was an influence for Cabrera, who was pretty much interested in this kind of, you know, looking for the origins, looking for, in Aimé Césaire words, looking for the native land. In fact, she publishes black short stories in 1936. I mean, as you can see, she was an upper-class white woman doing anthropological work with the black community in those years in Cuba, which is not very common, of course. And, well, she started exploring this kind of in-between narrative. This is something that interests me a lot, that culminates in a book called El Monte, The Wilderness, published in 1954, which is an open text, halfway between anthropology and literature, full of various voices making various appearances, constructed through strategies that constantly cancel each other. In El Monte, Cabrera confronts the reader with essential dilemmas. What is fiction and what is reality? What is anthropology and what is literature? What can we declare authentic in a discourse when authorship and therefore authority is fragmented and in a certain way excluded? Where should we place Cabrera? In the corridor of culture, outside narrative? Why was Lam, with his work The Jungle, placed in a corridor out of context? Was it because, as Yo discusses in his text, Rubin's approach to the Cuban artist placed him in a way outside history, capital letters, of course, turning him, and I quote Rubin's words, into the first surrealist to make primitive and ethnic sources central to his art, end quote, an exotic, peripheric artist, condemning Lam to a colorless and predictable narration, always under the influence, of course, of great Picasso, who was the first painter to use primitive and ethnic sources in La Demoiselle d'Avignon. But I would like you to draw your attention to something which is, you know, one of the main points in my presentation. Why should we always work by comparison? I would like to quote Mika Ball in this respect, when she's discussing Artemisia Gentileschi, and she said maybe comparing, which is something that we do all the time in art history, is not the right way to proceed. I would like to emphasize that. In fact, I would even go farther. I would say Picasso takes a lot from Lam too. But of course, this is not the point of my presentation, although it's very important for the art history established narrative referring to Latin America that always puts Picasso as a mediator for anything happening in modernity anywhere in the world. My question here is could probably be trickier as far as museums and cultural strategies are concerned. My question here is what if they place Lam in the corridor, not because he was a Cuban artist and therefore he would not go upstairs because he was a peripheric artist, but because nobody really knew where to place him. Because experts were confused because it was very difficult to define this work that was at the same time figurative and abstract, etc. It didn't fit anyway to Barth's charts. It was too slippery. It was a work that needed this kind of exclusion in a way, in a positive way too, as Luis was saying, because it was very unique to a certain extent. Where to place that problem? I mean, it was really a problem for the canonical art history, but in the corridor. And I think, this is something that is happening all the time to Latin American art. This is Tarsila da Moral, and she's very Mondrian, and at the same time she's very Africa. In this work, 1923, La Negra, of course, a black woman. Again, another problem, now that the Rijksmuseum is changing titles, avoiding this kind of words like portrait of a black girl, etc. But in this case, using the word black woman, I think is using in a kind of a political statement to define Brazilianness in a way. So I think things tend to be more complicated when dealing to, as Luis was saying, when dealing to this kind of modernity from Latin America. I think perhaps Latin American artists are less prisoners to convention than those European artists, avant-garde artists. Barradas is also a good example. This is Leja Clark, of course, and she's an in-betweener too. You could say that at the Museum of Modern Art. Barradas, who has lots of, is a very important figure for Spanish avant-garde. I mean, how to define Barradas, where to place him? And of course, the same thing we could say of Reverón, which is anachronistic in a way, but what does it mean to be the first artist? Why should anybody be first? Why being first is better than being last? I mean, this is something that I would like to ask. In fact, I think it was very inspiring to see the exhibition, Reverón exhibition, curated by John Ederfield and held by Luis Pérez-Oramas here at MoMA some years ago. Because I mean, seeing him so close to Pollock, sometimes the works, I mean, especially his objects, which are so very beautiful and poetical. Seeing them close to Pollock made me think that they were both using the line in a kind of very poetical, precise way. And it was very interesting to confront, not compare them, or not even confront maybe, but sort of, start a conversation between the two of them. Of course, this is a kind of re-narration, and I think this is a good starting point again to re-narrate everything. North is south, south is north. In fact, I think when artists cross the Atlantic, I was talking to somebody before. This is of course Mondrian at MoMA, and I think when Mondrian crosses the Atlantic Ocean, he becomes a totally different person. Not only in South America or Latin America, I think he's a great influence for Venezuela, even for people, some more contemporary Venezuelan artists. But I mean, even when he goes to the United States, he's a completely different artist. I think of course, the canonical art history again, I think has relegated the Dutch neoplasticism to a secondary place, and they always talk about surrealism and unconscious, etc., when talking about abstract expressionism. But I think I wouldn't absolutely agree with that. I think the Mondrian reception is very important in the US too, for obvious reasons. And above all, I think this is part, and I won't take much more time, Luis. I'm sorry if I'm being too long. I would like to discuss this artist, which is Sophie Teuber-Arp, which was very close to Torres-García in this respect. They were working together in Cercle Carré, and she's a Swiss artist. And of course, she's difficult to find a place in art history. In fact, I mean, she's been excluded in the bad and in the good and in the bad way. Some years ago, at the exhibition in Paris, Elle, at the Pompidou Center, they showed women in their collection, and she was not included in the list of women. I don't know why, because they have very good pieces of Sophie Teuber-Arp. Torres-García and Sophie Teuber-Arp are always hung in the corridor, and I think, it's interesting because maybe my point here is maybe they're not excluded because of political reasons. Torres-García is Latin American artist, Sophie Teuber-Arp is a woman artist, but because of more formal reasons, because nobody knew where to place them, because they were too problematic, I would say. I don't mean to say that these factors, this is the Marionettes by Sophie Teuber-Arp, they're very playful too. We were discussing yesterday at the exhibition, the different playful objects Torres was doing, and I think, this is, or making, and I think the same thing happens with Sophie Teuber-Arp. I said that, Torres and Arp are probably excluded for less political reasons, I'd say. In fact, Guillermo de Torre explains that Torres-García becomes sort of expelled from avant-garde, international avant-garde, when he lives for Montevideo, I think probably when he lives from Madrid. And he tries to see that one of the problems that are raised, trying to find a place for him, because he was not living in Paris. But I think, he was too difficult to find a place, because he was too problematic. He was not abstract, he was not concrete, etc. Well, I was thinking that probably concrete art is always placed in the corridor, because nobody really knows what to do with concrete art in any museums, which is very interesting. And of course, in the case of Sophie Teuber-Arp, she was a Dada dancer, and then she became, and she made Dada heads, as they're called, and then she became a constructivist. What is this? What is this kind of opposition art history is not prepared to deal with? They were outsiders in both cases, and I said they didn't belong anywhere, and this is interesting. They couldn't be compared to anything because they were quite unique, I think. So if we accept this hypothesis as possible, as a possible starting point for the discussion, probably a different explanation can be given to many artists, Latin American excluded artists, in the bad and in the wrong way in art history. Well, now Torres-García finally is gone upstairs. Thank you very much, Luis, for this beautiful exhibition. But of course, there will always be somebody somewhere, somehow waiting in the hallway next to the code room, because nobody knows really where to place them, because art history is not ready to accept exceptions, from my point of view. So I believe our task as art critics, art historians, museum people, etc., is not only rescue the in-betweeners and take them upstairs, whatever that may mean, because they will help us read the canonical art pieces in a better, richer, innovative fashion, letting them express their differences in an after-belonging era, as I would like to call our era, the after-belonging era. But most of all, I think we should try to find different narratives to approach these exceptions without sort of trying to put them into these predetermined models that our history always needs to define things. Thank you very much.
First, I want to thank Luis Pérez-Oramas for this fabulous invitation. I'm not talking about Brazil today, besides mentioning that my friends are dying of envy of me talking at MoMA. This major retrospective reveals totalizing and structural vision of Torres-García, thinking mainly through his painting, sculpture, objects, and what interests me in particular, his bibliographic production, theoretical texts about constructivism, autobiographical texts, manifestos, and finally the Nameless City, La Ciudad Sin Nombre, 1941, a kind of illustrated novel that has deserved little critical attention and was partially treated in the catalog from Sergio Chaifec's article. Since the beginning of the artistic production in Barcelona, the urban plays a prominently role as a theme in Torres-García pictorial work. The city, exalted by most of the historic avant-gardes through the Uruguayan painter, acquires characteristic features. Lettrism, understandable or not, is part of Torres-García urban work, urban scene. It is as if the city landscape and writing make up part of one same visual experience. The city always appears fragmented, juxtaposed, and superimposed. The break with traditional Renaissance perspective helps him to compose the foregrounds that would become the basis for constructivist orthogonal painting. The street, towering buildings, anonymous individual or groups of people, the cafe, the streetcar, the locomotive, steamship, the calendar, or the clock are themes that insistently predominate his urban painting. In short, elements that when combined cause an illusion of temporal acceleration due to the spatial verticalization incorporated into one foreground without perspective. The clipped word, almost always undecipherable, as well as the random numbers, reveals an atomizing world whose unity can only be achieved through fragmented and juxtaposed perception. Torres-Garcia periods in Catalonia, New York, and Paris were all rich in terms of urban issues. And if the words and the letter constitute a constant in his painting from these periods, what is the point of mixing or joining such distinct codes? The intense parallelism of painting and writing leads me to believe that underlying these codes, Torres-Garcia has a unified thought, constructive universalism. This enables him to coherently express different languages that nevertheless belong to a single reflexive matrix. The analogical and motivated images coexist with the arbitrary word, the product of linguistic and social norms and conventions. Actually, Torres-Garcia's own world is almost an ideogrammatic design and therefore consists of a unified aesthetic project in which it is impossible to separate one code from the other. In New York street scene 1923 that we see here, where the tram's horizontality, the anonymous beings and the business world prevailing in a space covered with signs, the tram itself, a kind of totem of modernity, appears in the foreground opposite a carriage pulled by two horses flaunting the world colors. One facing the other, they can be interpreted as the encounter of two historic moments in dialectical opposition. On the one hand, the carriage, pulled by horses, is a reminiscence of a rural and agricultural universe arrested in the clock of modernity. On the other hand, the tram, in the foreground, constitutes the representation of the modern machine. The world colors is completely dissociated from the possible content of the carriage. Pointing to unreal and dislocated goods might be how Torres-Garcia escapes from the predictable and accentuates the alienation of the modern world. Moreover, the world colors also displaces the reader's attention to how color is constructed in the painting itself. The focus of this scene viewed from above make us think of a Torres-Garcia who observes and paints from a high window on the same street, similar to the observer in Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Man of the Crowd, which was so well analyzed by Walter Benjamin. The same New York street scene that a few years later visited and registered by the surrealist imagination of Garcia Lorca is full of posters that occupy the horizontality of the painting from end to end. Here there are two legible words, delicatessen and colors. Other signs are undecipherable. The disappearance of the writing could be seen as a post-impressionist effect, whereby the emergent and suggested speed of the tram blurs the contours, which have now become patches of colors. Torres-Garcia places the painting's viewer before a city that is not just meant to be seen, but also to be read. The reading of these cities is threatened by the idea of chaos, of a missing order, recovered later in the Constructivist project. In this scene, the blurry and fragmented words become noise that fill Torres-Garcia's urban landscape. 2 decades later, we find the painter in Montevideo. There he writes La ciudad sin nombres, 1944, a work of fiction of little more than 100 and number pages of text interwoven with illustrations that serve as an iconic support and reference to the corresponding written passage. Torres-García returns to the city where he was born after 43 years of being away, enriched by his Catalonia, New York, and Paris experience from 20s and 30s. From his critical discourse, we can discern the way of thinking of someone who lived amid the historical avant-gardes, who witnessed the New York Stock Exchange crisis, the emergence of fascism, the Spanish Civil War, and finally World War II, contemporaneous with the production of this book. This is the original book. It's very, very small. Then later they made a larger edition. And you have both of them here at the library. The name of the city was written when he was 67. That is, the book was prepared over the course of 600 conferences in Montevideo, and it has 253 illustrations that make up the theoretical monument of constructive universalism. Torres-García lives the most productive years of his career in Montevideo, where he founds the School of the South and Taller Torres-García. His return to his hometown in a certain way resembles that of Borges regarding the foundational character of his country of origin. However, unlike Borges, who takes pleasure in the poem as a gesture that culminates and crystallizes memory, Torres-García project is that of transforming culture through constructive art. I believe that the listing of these historical facts is important for understanding Torres-García complex symbolic system, where the rejection of industrial civilization prevails, as does the establishment of a cosmic, total, encompassing aesthetic whose primitive basis is a matter of returning to an American thinking of Aztec and Inca background, and for some reason, Torres-García discarded the Mayan culture from his system. A pre-Columbian indigenous thought that rescues the historic, sacred, quasi-religious dimension for the modern mind without implying a return to the primitive. It is important to highlight that there was no indigenous culture in Uruguay, unlike so many countries of the Andes and Mexico, which underscores the total utopian nature of the Torres-García project. I cannot just but mention in this brief talk how the historical avant-gardes were attracted by early cultures. Estrella has just shown part of it now, which are beautifully displayed in Torres-García's 32 album Structure, which has been partially reproduced in the catalog. And it is worth mentioning, as Borges did at some point, that those writers who wrote about the gauchos were eminently urban writers, and that the gauchos probably never read themselves. The same is true of Brazil's greatest 19th century Indianist writer, José de Alencar, who possibly had never made contact with indigenous people. And surely Vicente Dorrego Monteiro, whose Marajoara art was inspired by museum collections. He had never been in the Amazons, I suppose. I will deal briefly, because of time, with some basic elements of the nameless city. The urban as a critique of modernity, aesthetics as a critical discourse, and the Montevideo foundational constructive project. The title unfolds in two possible singularities. On the one hand, the foundational character of a city which has to be named if it doesn't have a name. Gesture of the demiurge, of the conqueror, of the father, holder of the power of the world that unveils a universe. And on the other, the lack of words also translates into the principle of absence, silence and emptiness, which is a product of the serial and monotonous nature of the modern city. Although in one of her essays, Beatriz Salo recommends forgetting Walter Benjamin because his reading of the flaneur has been vulgarized, it is almost inevitable to interpret the narrative character of this fiction as pure perception or consciousness amidst of the urban crowd of the fourmillant cité through which he wanders. Anonymity, an essential condition of the flaneur, opens the narrative, and I quote, "I just arrived in a city whose name I do not know. What connects me to all this? Nothing and everything. Nothing because I do not know or have not heard of anyone, but everything because I am also a man." So, the sameness, the indifferent discourse, and the repetition as one of the problems brought by modernity are portrayed by the flaneur narrator. Always through the same doors, every day the same people enter and exit. They route throughout the city, taking the same path. So Torres-García, more a philosopher than a poet, and almost more a philosopher than a painter, describes a moment upon reaching another city. "Modern neighborhoods," I quote, "are alike everywhere." And he says that in 1941. "Lacking personality, trade has now a unified city, the same neon signs and the same posters, the same taste in shops and display cases, the same vehicles on the street, and the same standardized type in the passers." So we have to remember that this is Montevideo in 1941, so it's really visionary. The book's last pages recount the last and founding journey, but the return to his hometown surprises. I will have to finish because I'm over with my time, but I just want to point the attention of a character in the novel, which is a sandwich man. There is a continuous presence of a sandwich man in Torres-García narrative, and it's nothing less than surprising. The sandwich man in the 20s and 30s was a very common character in Paris. What is extremely surprising is an extraordinary picture of Torres-García 2 decades prior to the novel in his painted overalls, New York inscribed on them in 21. In the analysis of the curator Pérez-Oramas of this image, he says that for all the grand galas Torres-García attended, for one of which he designed a famous suit, overalls a la Rodchenko, that made the city material on his body, the disappointment, even the failure of his time in America is clear in a photograph of him wearing that suit and perched on his bed disguised as a human ad. So writing the body, or the body as writing, is already registered in Torres-García at the beginning of the 20s, such as the sandwich man in the novel in the early 40s. It is a matter of a mobile writing within the modern city, a walking poster victim of the new laws of the market. Despite the profusion of images that the book contains, the ad man has not been designed. What is that Torres-García proposes in his system in general, and in this novel in particular? A cosmic overall vision able to overcome the affective fragmentation, the sense of a loss of individuality, and the alienation in the modern city. I will only show 3 pages that I have chosen from the book. This is after you open the first page. The title, you can see a tram, and as he writes colors, here he writes way. You see it's all juxtaposed. He writes and he designs. He writes as part of the same sentence, the same syntax. And finally, this is the last page where the Taller Torres-García, TTG, and you have the boceto as a, a sketch of the monument of the Republic that Estrella had shown the photograph. It's a coincidence, but here you have the sketch of the project. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Luis and to MoMA for inviting me to participate. I want to speak today about Torres-Garcia's geo-positioning. And I'm thinking both about the way that he positioned his own art and how his art has been positioned in relationship to the geography of the Earth. And in the process, I'll bring up geopolitical and geoeconomic shifts that I believe shaped the particular way that Torres-Garcia imagined his art and its publics. In the process, I'll also be talking about the MoMA, where we sit today, and its project of Latin American art of the early 1940s. And in this way, I'll talk about interactions between what this panel is calling the modernity of the South and what we might call the modernity of the North, both in quotation marks. In the process, I hope to address and to complicate this idea of the modernity of the South. So Torres-Garcia, the person, underwent periods of intensive mobility and also periods of prolonged stasis. He was born in Uruguay in the 1870s, and he moved to Europe in the 1890s, to New York in 1920, and then back to Europe and returned to Montevideo in 1934, where he would stay until his death in 1949. But Torres-Garcia, the artist, versus Torres-Garcia, the person, drew from an even more expansive geography, from the pre-Columbian to the African to the European. In works that Torres-Garcia produced while in Paris in the early 1930s, and also in the late 1920s, he would sometimes include the acronym TSF, which we see kind of in the center of the composition on the right a little bit down, which stands for Télécommunication sans fil, which we can translate to wireless communication. And we might ask, how was Torres-Garcia's art both like and unlike wireless communication? So it was unlike the telecommunications of his time in that its mode of transmission was visual, but it was like the telecommunicated message in that it compressed space and time in its conveyance of a particular code. Upon his return to Uruguay in 1934, the signal would be transmitted to artists and intellectuals in Chile and Paraguay and Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, and the United States and beyond. And this dissemination was largely through his books and publications, not through the movement of his own body. And these books and publications included both texts and images to convey the signal. When in 1934 Torres-Garcia returned to Montevideo after 4 decades abroad, he told reporters that he hoped to produce an art movement in Uruguay that would rival Paris. So in that way, he was effectively putting Montevideo on the map. 1 year later, in perhaps his most iconic image, the first version from 1935 you see in the exhibition in a small lecture pamphlet in a vitrine, and here's a version from 1936. In this iconic kind of chain of images, Torres-Garcia inverted a map of South America. And I would say that this map points to the way in which our picture of the world is a construction shaped by relations of power that have been communicated visually. And of course, there's a long history of this, as we see in the 16th century map of what we now call the Americas. But these visualized power relations can just as easily be reoriented or turned upside down, even if they cannot be as easily inverted in the world outside the image. I think the map also allows us to think about the shifting geographical imagination of the 1930s and early 1940s. The global Great Depression had damaged economies and trade relationships throughout the world. In the Americas, the United States had initiated what was called the Good Neighbor Policy in 1933, forbidding military intervention between the nations of the hemisphere. By the late 1930s, cultural exchanges between the Americas became more frequent. With the rise of fascism in Europe, trade patterns shifted from a transatlantic circuit to a north-south orientation, with the US becoming the principal market for Latin America's raw materials and the principal source of its manufacturers as part of a longer process. The project to rid the hemisphere of Nazi sympathizers during World War II made these inter-American bonds grow ever closer, not least through the efforts of Nelson Rockefeller, who for a time was both president of MoMA and the coordinator of the Office of Inter-American Affairs in the US State Department. Contemporaneous to, but independent of the good neighbor policy, Torres-Garcia developed a network across Latin America. As I mentioned, this spread to Chile, to Argentina, to Colombia, to Paraguay, to the United States, to Mexico, that produced a parallel, if distinct, version of inter-American cultural exchange. But the base of operations was not in New York or Washington, D.C., but in Montevideo. And to give a larger scope to this topic beyond the activities of the US State Department and of Torres-Garcia, we can also think about the Mexican muralist Siqueiros, who in the same period was making works of art in Argentina, Uruguay, Mexico, Chile, Cuba, and the United States. But whereas Siqueiros championed the use of industrial materials, Torres-Garcia increasingly turned to what he called Indo-American culture and aesthetics in his efforts to unify the art and culture of America. And as I think sometimes is left out, the subtitle to his book, Constructive Universalism, is The Unification of the Art and Culture of America, published in 1944 in Argentina. So like Latin America itself, Indo-America cannot be found on any map. In Torres-Garcia's thinking, it included pre-Columbian aesthetics and sometimes contemporary indigenous image making. Already in 1935, Torres-Garcia had urged artists of the Americas to, quote, convert the foreign into their own substance, using their own materials. And in his lecture, The School of the South from 1935, he declared, I believe that the age of colonialism and importation is over. If an artist didn't learn from Europe at the right time, so much the worse for him, for that moment has passed. In other words, Torres-Garcia's map now placed the Americas at the center. With the work on the screen, Torres-Garcia followed his own advice to the letter, using an animal hide from Uruguay. Indeed, beef, sheep's wool, cattle, animal hides. These were Uruguay's chief industries in the time period. And upon this hide, Torres-Garcia paints a camouflaged but nevertheless visible inverted map. See, in the center of these other shapes. That same year, Torres-Garcia became aware of a MoMA exhibition, that year's Indian Art of the United States, which he learned about through a letter from a colleague who was living in New York. And it appears that Torres-Garcia was sent a copy of the exhibition's catalog already in 1941, which suggests he may have been looking at images painted on animal hide by Native Americans in the United States when producing Indo-America the same year, also on animal hide. And this suggests potentially that Torres-Garcia was expanding the geography of his constructive universalism to include the United States, the North. So if Torres-Garcia's constructive universalism could metabolize a MoMA exhibition, so too could MoMA exhibitions metabolize Latin America and its art. Central to MoMA's Latin American art project was Nelson Rockefeller, who in 1940 and 1941, as I mentioned, straddled his roles as president of the museum with his position as the coordinator of the Office of Inter-American Affairs in the US State Department. And the same year that Torres-Garcia made his animal hide painting, the Office of Inter-American Affairs sent exhibitions of US contemporary painting around Latin America, as traced by yet another map seen here, which is the back cover of the catalog of that traveling exhibition of US contemporary art, which went to all of the cities that are marked on the map. And in fact, Torres-Garcia lectured at the opening of the exhibition when it made its stop in Montevideo. At this time, MoMA exhibitions such as 20 Centuries of Mexican Art and Brazil Builds were helping to construct the field of Latin American art as we know it today. The exhibition of the MoMA's Latin American collection included Torres-Garcia's painting The Port, which had been purchased from his studio in Montevideo during a collecting trip funded by Rockefeller. So by bringing up the history of MoMA's engagements with Latin America in this period, I'm trying to show a moment of contact between what we are calling the modernity of the South and what we might call the modernity of the North, which MoMA has long represented in the art historical imagination, at least since the Cold War. However, in the period in which Torres-Garcia was working, these polarized North-South modernities had not yet been purified and were much more open. And we can see this openness not only in the work produced in Latin America from this era, but also in works of art produced by artists in the United States. For instance, in the work of Adolf Gottlieb, whose pictograms echo and parallel Torres-Garcia's own gridded sign systems. I want to look at one last work by Torres today, this one in MoMA's collection as well. Here we see traces of Van Doesburg and Mondrian, but also Incan stonework, which recurs in a number of Torres-Garcia's works of the 1930s. And I want to analyze the conjoined hybridized elements in this work as an example of what I'm thinking about recently as Torres-Garcia's morphological approach to art. And I think morphology helps us to understand this artist and his particular relationship to modernity, Southern or otherwise. Upon arriving back in Uruguay in 1934, Torres-Garcia had written to the Uruguayan government. The artist proposed opening a morphological institute and a morphological museum that would follow. This concept of morphology has a history that's difficult to trace, but you could trace it back to Goethe or to Aby Warburg. And it's a system that does not arrange objects according to chronological and geographical categories. Rather, morphology produces chains of objects linked through their affinities and resemblances. And indeed, we can see an example of this in the collage notebook in the vitrine upstairs of structures from 1932, I believe, in its juxtaposition of varied forms that might share or share disjunctions and conjunctions with each other. And in the system of morphology, whatever criticisms we might level against it, there's no anxiety of influence because images in the system are not arranged hierarchically. In other words, there's no first and no north. I want to end my presentation with a quotation from an art historian who lived in Paris at the same time as Torres, Henri Faucillon, who shared his interest in the morphology of art. And Faucillon's book, The Life of Forms, was published in 1934, the same year Torres-Garcia returned to Montevideo. Let's listen to Faucillon while thinking about Torres and the particular question of a modernity of the South. Faucillon wrote in 1934, "A work of art is specific, local, individual, and it is our brightest token of universality." So, local, specific, and our brightest token of universality. Sometimes form might be said to exert a magnetic attraction upon a great variety of meanings, or rather, it might be compared to a form of mold into which are successively cast different materials which, yielding to the contours that press against them, acquire a wholly unexpected significance. Form may, it is true, become formula and canon. In other words, it may be abruptly frozen into a normative type. But primarily, form is a mobile life in a changing world, the state of a style, or if one prefers, a state in the life of forms, is simultaneously the guarantor and the promoter of diversity. Thank you.
Well, I was checking time for the break that is scheduled in 25 minutes. So maybe we will have an opportunity to discuss and to get questions from you all. I think it's such an interesting. I mean, it's certainly chance situation, but I think the arguments followed beautifully from Estrella's reflection on these singularities that get locked in the check room hallway, and Jorge delving into the nameless city. And I was all the time thinking of the books that he wrote in the 20s in New York, which are the opposite. This is New York would be the maybe New York is the peak of a name, the name that the city that is only a name, or the nameful city, and Montevideo is this kind of other place that does not yet have a name, and it's an interesting dialectics there. And then Niko, I think it's what all your suggestions were brilliant, and I am extremely happy that we might maybe the opportunity to have a discussion and a conversation about these topics, morphology and form. What I think, I'll just throw a general question that is a little bit suggested by your lecture, your paper, Niko, is how to move from, I mean, not necessarily how to move. When you deal with an artist like Torres-García, and I think the maps with these arrows that Niko Vicario showed us are very telling. You have to necessarily confront the fact that we know people move, and we live in a moment when that is a very critical question politically. But forms move too, we know that. And I've always thought that a challenge for us art historians, and particularly those who are working with the singularity of objects in the museum place, is to try to produce an art history that is topological rather than genealogical. That would be absolutely free from the anxiety of influences, because it would take as a ground the fact that when forms move, they change, independently of any genealogical link that you might trace within their history. And I think that is, I mean, I would say, as Galileo, e pur si muove, that you might not like it. It is that way. That's a fact. And so somehow Torres is a study case for that. But then there are the levels, the geopolitical level, and you know, maybe the Indian exhibition would have not happened at MoMA if the war was not going on in Europe. We don't know that. Maybe the Latin American collection exhibition in 1943 would have never happened if MoMA could have done another Picasso show. And Estrella showed us Broadway Boogie Boogie, which came to this institution thanks to Brazilian robber, because it was given anonymously by Maria Martins. It was rejected by the museum, and Maria Martins talked with her husband, the ambassador of Brazil in Washington, and basically told him, you speak with your friend Nelson Rockefeller, and you may get that painting in. And that is 1943. So this country is entering in the war and needs rubber from Brazil. So Mondrian would have never imagined that there is an archaeology of rubber in his beautiful painting, at least for its very existence in the museum. So, I mean, that's another level of complexity. And I like the idea of there is the Department of State strategy, Torres tactics, and then the muralist strategy, that may be not a tactic too, at the same time going on. Anyway, it's I just wanted to bring the idea of this topology of forms, of this idea of a curatorial practice that would ground a topological art history that would not be worried about who was first and who is last, because that is, at the end, irrelevant. What matters is what is changed, period. And I don't know if you have something to say to that, and obviously, please, if you have questions, we're happy to have a conversation with you about these three fascinating talks.
Can I
Claro, sí.
I was very surprised at Niko's statement when he quoted that Torres-Garcia...
Sorry. Okay.
Hi. I was very surprised at Niko's statement when you said that Torres-Garcia suggested that we should go back to our origins, work our own things, and reject what's foreign, and so on. It has very much to do with what Oswald de Andrade suggested in his Anthropophagic Manifesto. That was in 29, really, to reject, not to reject, but to assimilate and to reformulate into national amalgam, not forgetting the colonial past, but making profit of the modern, but with our own roots.
Yes, no, I think that's a very good comparison. What I extracted that quote from was from the School of the South lecture, where he is at the same time in other sections seeming to use a metaphor of industrialization. So I used that quote from 1935 to talk about this kind of more primitivizing turn of the later 1930s. What I think is interesting but also ambiguous is the way that he thinks about construction. So construction out of one's own materials, we can think of this almost as a kind of analogy for import substitution, industrialization in this time period in Uruguay, but I think the direction he ends up taking it is away from the industrial towards this, these other cultural reference points. And so for me, it was interesting to think, because I also had considered this comparison with de Andrade a little bit, is the way that Andrade's metaphor is one of consumption, that albeit one of a very active, predatory, in a way, consumption, cannibalism, whereas Torres's is one of production, and yet they share so much. Yeah.
Any question? Yes, there.
Thank you all for your wonderful talks.
We have a micro there. If you wonderful, thank you.
Hi, Niko, I had a question about your suggestion, and I know you didn't phrase this as an assertion, that perhaps Torres-Garcia was thinking about including North America in this unification of America, and you pointed towards the use of the animal skin as a potential avenue for doing that. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that, and perhaps Jorge Schwartz, you could also speak on this, because I know his time in New York was so formative for the basis of universal constructivism. So I'm curious to know, is it possible, or what you think, if it's possible for this to be a larger framework for the Americas as a whole, given this hemispheric framework? Thanks.
Thanks, Laurie. I think this year, 1941, was really significant. And so, as I mentioned very briefly, I did a very brief talk, Torres-Garcia was responding to this exhibition of contemporary US painting that had come on this tour of Latin America and arrived that fall in Montevideo. And he gives his lecture there saying, okay, good job doing your America, you as artists. You do it best when you use impeccable technique for painting factories, would be a generalization of his commentary, but well done at times. Nevertheless, he goes on to assert that construction constructive form should be the future art of America. What I think is interesting and slippery is this word America itself, which in the United States we think of as referring to the United States. We have the term the Americas, which seems more inclusive, but he's using this America category certainly to refer to Latin America, and I think it has an ambiguous relationship to the United States at this time, though I can't pinpoint exactly how he meant it then. But I think his engagement with that exhibition, his visit from Lincoln Kirstein, who was collecting and expanding the Latin American art collection, and certainly comments that he made that with references to the good neighbor policy, certainly makes me think that the United States was on his radar. Now, from kind of Rodin and his ideas from the year 1900, we might think about the United States as an antagonist of industry that's impinging on the spirit of the rest of the continent. For me, it gets a little muddy around this period, so I think it's open for debate. The role that his time in New York and the early 20s played in that process, I think gave him some access. He mentions in his response to this exhibition of US contemporary painting, I actually lived in New York, so I know what it's like, so I'm qualified to judge. I did notice in a presentation on the Catalogue Raisonné that Cecilia made at NYU in the spring that one image that was shown was a painting he did of New York in 1941. And I'm interested in the fact that he seems to have painted this representation of New York in this exact year. So this year seems very fruitful and important to me, if that helps to answer my speculative ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking that maybe, you were pointing the muralists, and I think it's a close phenomenon to that, isn't it? I think Diego Rivera was trying to have this Pan-American kind of conception. And I think it's interesting, as far as, Luis was talking before, because I'm doing this research on Picasso and Latin American artists. And I think it's interesting because sometimes Picasso's influence goes to the Mexican muralists, especially with the political production of Latin America. And it's interesting because sometimes I don't mean to say they didn't know Picasso, because of course everybody knew Picasso, but there is an interesting connection, trying to find this kind of Pan-American approach, or whatever you want to call it, and you were pointing them out, and I think it's a very good point. What could have happened if the world hadn't been in Europe? This is a very interesting thing, because I think it would have changed completely the change of forms too.
Of course, and when Niko was talking, when you get to be trapped in the storages of MoMA, that my friend Paulo Herkenhoff called years ago the second left communist territory in the Americas, the first being the island of Cuba, because Lincoln Kirstein's acquisitions in the 40s. You realize to what extent the modernity of the South, to use the fictitious concept, and the modernity of the North had fluent links until the end of the war. It's obvious. Whatever it is, the mutation, the break, the wall was built with the appearance of the New York School. And that is when a divide that was unbreachable until recently, was set. Divide that had also effects in the life of the museum, setting some primacies for exhibitions, and then things that got, even if acquired, stored without being exhibited. But that's a footnote of the problem. The problem, I think, is larger, and I think maybe we'll have the opportunity to have a conversation with Maria about this, because I think we clearly see two drives between that divide, and one is constructive in the South, and the other is expressionist in the North. And obviously this is too schematic, but that is. So we can't avoid, it would be stupid to avoid that there are very strong geopolitical determinations in what we think is art history vis-a-vis this institution, vis-a-vis a case like Torres. But then, obviously, if you have questions, please, yes.
Is this working? Yeah. Hi, my name is Susan Platt. I was speaking with Catherine. Where is she? And she asked me to stand up. I worked with Daniel Robbins on the original Guggenheim exhibition, and that's why I'm here, because I want to honor his pioneering work in 1970 when who had heard of Torres-Garcia in New York? I'm not sure how he got the original idea, but I also want to thank you for a very, very beautiful show. It is a stunning show. What I remember most clearly, Danny, being excited about were the toys that were just discovered. But my question is for about the coat room question, because right outside of us, in this auditorium, near the women's room here, is the display of the El Teco de la Balena. They haven't yet risen up to the glory of the top floor, but what I want to ask is whether this group was in fact reacting against Torres-Garcia, but also this sort of messy group. They were very messy, as I understand it, doing Dada and putting animal parts on the floor. This sort of messiness is not part of what art history likes either. So for those two reasons, is that why they are in the basement? That's my question.
That's interesting. Thank you very much, and I'm happy that you were able to speak about Robinson and the Guggenheim show, and that I'm very happy to meet you. And we were precisely speaking about that with me and Luis Camnitzer before we got here. It would be easy for me to say that those vitrines displaying El Techo de la Ballena are there because our library does not have room for what any library in a museum or a university has, which is a display room for vitrines where rare books and special collections are shown. That is a factual reason why they are here. They should be in the library if the library would have that facility or that possibility. But that's not, I won't escape the question. I mean, and I was saying that that is an example of the syndrome of the coat check. Yes, maybe. First of all, this is an archive, is a documentary archive that was given to the museum by the only individual in Venezuela who had collected this material. And it's the only individual who had collected this material, including museums, which have no collected this material. So it's the only collection, the only integral collection of El Techo de la Ballena that has been done, gathered. And we are very happy that is now at MoMA's library. And I don't want to take all the time explaining that, but there is a link, and it's also a paradox, you know, because the El Techo de la Ballena was a kind of neo-Dadaist, politically driven and iconoclastic group that took place in Venezuela at the end of the 1950s and early 1960s. Its member became, some of them, supporters of the guerrilla in the 1960s. They embodied left-wing politics, and they are, some of them, still alive. But their most important contribution to Venezuelan art was this kind of splash of iconoclasticism at a moment when what I have called the kinetic academia, obsessed with the transparency and the cleanness of the constructive works, was flourishing publicly for the first time. As these people brought body and flesh and blood and corpses and all that elements, a little bit like the actionists in Vienna. But what is interesting, and we were discussing yesterday, what we call the dirty neoplasticism of Torres-Garcia, and the precariousness, and the presence of stains, and the not pure resolution of the works. You know, these people who belong to El Techo de la Ballena, they have an archaeology with a group that was constituted in Venezuela in the 1940s. It's El Taller Libre de Arte. And I will point to Niko that he has to go a little arrow to Caracas, because in 1949, El Taller Libre de Arte organized an exhibition with works by Torres-Garcia and other artists from Rio de la Plata. That is the sparking event of the constructivist Venezuelan art. And these people who were part of El Techo de la Ballena almost 20 years later, or maybe 10 years later, they had to do with that eclectic hybrid group that actually has been operational in inscribing the legacy of Torres-Garcia for the first time in Venezuela. So there is it's paradoxical, but it's very interesting. And I hope that one day we will have a better facility for the library, and that we will show the material in a better way than there. But let me tell you, because I believe that incremental reforms are good, we are happy that they are there rather than nothing. I don't know if you have, yes, there's a question there.
Hello. I was fascinated to hear from Estrella, Diego, that Torres-Garcia and Tauber Arp worked together. Is there a way you could show us just a bubble of that collaboration?
No, well, I'm sorry. They both, in a way, they of course, they both belong to Cercle Carré. They worked together at that time. And I think, in a way, they were the most, I mean, both of them were very ambiguous in their, I mean, they were not pure forms, as some of the members of Cercle Carré were. And I think they had this kind of parallel exile, let's put it that way, because I think, and they have been read in a similar way by history from my point of view. Well, people say that Torres-Garcia, I mean, if you have a look at the magazine, first thing, you get the impression that all forms reproduced in the magazine are very pure, except for Sophie Teuber-Arp and Torres-Garcia. I don't mean to say that they're figurative in a radical way, but they still sustain or maintain some figurative forms, okay? And that was not what was expected from certain kinds of avant-garde. Yeah, tell me.
Did they actually collaborate?
Oh, no, not together, no. Just as, well, they collaborated in the magazine as part of that project. But they were, I mean, maybe I didn't explain myself clearly. I'm sorry about that. But they didn't collaborate making works together. I was sort of comparing them because they had a similar destiny, let's put it that way, okay? And and then Sophie Teuber-Arp, I think I didn't say that when I was giving my presentation. She was invited. She was already dead, but she was invited for twice to the Brazilian Biennale, to the Sao Paulo Biennale, and she was very well known in Brazil. So in that respect, she's one of the examples of artists, unknown artists in Europe, which when cross the continent due to the war or many other different forms of traveling and mapping, but they didn't collaborate. I mean, in a specific work, only they were together as part of the project of Cercle Carré. So I didn't explain myself. I do apologize for that.
But you know, I would add to that, Estrella and I have to announce the break now. But you know, it's a factual. They were very close. Torres-Garcia and the Arps, and Cecilia knows that. She has worked on Torres a lot. I mean, they were very close. I mean, it's not only that they were part of the same group, which is kind of quite a large group. Jean Arpa and Sofia Torres were very close to Torres and Torres' family. They would see each other frequently, and that is a fact in
Yeah, but they
Torres'.
didn't collaborate together.
No.
And I think probably, the avant-garde encounters are so crazy in a way and so unpredictable that I think, probably there is even a link between Lam and, Cercle Carré, I think it has been studied and researched, but not to the extent it deserves. I think, Cercle Carré is one of those avant-garde things that could give lots of information, but they didn't strictly collaborate in an artistic way, although they were very close, and I'm sure you know. And she was a great, no, I shouldn't say that, but she was a great influence to all avant-garde.
Wonderful. So we will gather back again in half an hour at 3 o'clock. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Sí, claro. Dime. Sí, sí. Welcome back. I'm happy to continue this event with our second session this afternoon. But before we begin with that second session, I left one question in the dark. I couldn't see well from here, and there was a question that was left in silence. So I will ask Jerónimo to use the micro, Jerónimo. Do we have a micro? So people will take one of those. There's one.
Thanks. I'll be very brief just so we can continue. But Niko, I found this idea of morphology very appealing, and it made me think of more recent theorizations about the idea of network and nodes, and by people like Latour and stuff like that. And when you had the image on your presentation, it seemed to me that in a way that painting could be read as the visualization of that network, of that sort of like morphology, which in turn turns into a different form. Like those different forms that are connected that are then transformed into a different form, which I think that also links very nicely to what Estrella was proposing about looking for ways to do art history that are not just comparative. And I want to ask you both, in the specific case of Torres-García, how do you see his writing as part of one of those forms or nodes that sort of like create that larger image?
Niko.
It's not an easy question. It's not an easy question, so we'll go first.
Okay, thank you for your comment. Yeah, I mean, someone like Latour I find inspiring. For instance, also some early texts like Drawing Things Together, where he talks about the power of drawing and maps to rethink our idea of kind of the geography of history. I don't know if I'm able to answer about the texts right now. Of course, I drew from the texts, right? The School of the South. I also extracted from the texts so that, and applied this text from 1935 about using your own materials and transforming the foreign into one's own substance. So I definitely look to the texts as a source for Torres-Garcia's thinking, though I tend to use the images as the spaces in which that thinking plays out. I don't know if you had a particular thought about how one might use the text to throw it back at you? Non-aggressively?
No, not really, but I was sort of wondering on how his writing, specifically his biographical writing, sort of like comes into play as that one other element that he is positioning, into this morphological reading that you're proposing. Or I don't know if it might not be relevant. It might be a morphology that only functions visually in terms of like sources.
I think it's something I have to think more about, but I think it's an important question. Yeah, sorry. I'll think about it and maybe we can talk after. Yeah. Good.
Well, I think it's a very good question, and I think it's a very paradoxical question too, because I think Torres-García, from our point of view in his texts, is very programmatic to a certain extent. I mean, he knows exactly where he's going and what he wants to achieve, etc., etc. And in this respect, he's doing his own choice and trying to follow that choice. But I have the impression that there is a text, which is his autobiography, that to me is very intriguing and very important because he's writing in the third person, which is, I think it's very modern in that respect because, the autobiographical works, which are like, in the 10 past years or something, have become very important. He's always writing. It's very easy to write about yourself as if you were another person and to split. This split he uses in his autobiographical text. And from my point of view, but of course, Schwartz is the expert and Cecilia is here too. I think, this text to me is probably the most radical of his texts and yesterday we were talking about this little Barbarian kind of, it's not a notebook, it's an image book. And I think that, I was thinking about that. The idea that there is, it's very programmatic, and that's why I said it's very paradoxical, and from my point of view, your question is very intriguing, very important. And at the same time, he's trying to break the rules in some of his texts, like his autobiography, and in that cuaderno, in that cuaderno de notas, which is, about time and about lots of things that were very relevant to him. So probably he's very paradoxical in that respect too. And I think, he wanted to be paradoxical to a certain extent. He's posing questions to the reader and the viewer because he's probably posing questions to himself. But it's a guess. It happens to me too. I have to think about your question because I think it's not an easy one. But the autobiography to me seems a key work to understand the modernity of the self and the split self. That sometimes, of course, everybody has commented on that, but I think this is probably a very intriguing test from many points of view to me, and it gives a hint of a different way to approach this kind of morphology. But I have to think about it.
Thank you. Well, so this second session of our encounter aims to discuss the legacy of Torres-García. Torres' work has often been labeled as constructivist, but if there is constructivism in such work, that's my take, we are probably forced to say that it is sometimes an antithetical constructivism. And when I say antithetical, antithesis, I am using Aby Warburg's notion of antithetical forms that he played within his understanding of symbolic survival of antiquity in Renaissance art. And it implies that those survivals in Warburg's work, those symbolical survivals appear in forms, in objects, in symbolic manifestations that are the opposite of what we would think they should be in order to bear that symbolic aspect. So they don't look like, they're specifically the opposite of what they actually are actually serving as an operational field for symbolic survival. An example, which is the ABC example for Warburg, is the primal dance of the Hopi Indians, the Pueblo Indians in Oraibi, is survival of the fight between Apollon and the snake in a Renaissance intermezzi, in a Renaissance theatrical intermezzi. And I myself have very approximative and amateurist way tried to project this concept into the understanding of Latin American modernism, in the sense that the struggling and the longing for and with modernity might be similar, mutatis mutandis, with all the to the struggling and longing for antiquity in the Western European hemisphere, and that the impossibility to reach that antiquity was probably similar to the impossibility to reach modernity in some places in Latin America. And so from there, antithetical productions that actually bear modernism among those communities, or that function as such among those communities. It's a complex problem, but in any way that marks an anthropological field for actions, for public politics, and then for image production and for the production of symbolic objects in Latin America. And I think that is the way I understand this antithetical constructivism in Torres-Garcia. But we know also that constructivism and constructivists, they have become passport concepts, notably when discussing forms of abstraction and artistic action in Latin America. So everything is constructivist. I mean, that's constructivist. That's a constructivist artist. And I think it's a little bit like what is happening with conceptualism. Luis Camnitzer, everything is conceptual. Everything is conceptualism, and it's another passport concept. So I am happy that Maria has accepted this invitation. And as I said at the beginning, I admire enormously her work, and I think Maria will enlighten us on these uses and maybe abuses of the term or the life of this term, constructivism, notably, as I said, and as she will do between the 19th and 30s. In as much as construction is central to Torres, one can think that there is also a conceptual dimension to his legacy. And this conceptual aspect has, of course, nothing to do with the way we currently understand conceptual art, obviously. But does not preclude that the fact that Torres-Garcia's legacy, notably in Uruguay, and Jorge Schwartz brought me this, is a 5 pesos bill with the face of Torres-Garcia and a constructive, universal construction in the back of the field. So this is the best example of to what extent Torres-Garcia's legacy in a country is strikingly strong. That legacy implies an array of conceptual problems, and to what extent the singularity of an artwork translates to the necessary impulse of generalization of a school, to what extent there are continuities and discontinuities between Torres-Garcia's oeuvre and the school of the South, continues, I think, to that question continues to cultivate and sometimes to animate discussions. And we know that also the School of the South continues to be active artistically today. So I also thought that Luis Camnitzer, from his Uruguayan point of view, if that such a thing could exist, and I think it's almost, that is antithetical. But I think that I was curious to hear and listen to Luis about Torres and maybe, and I have to say, we know that Luis is an antithetical figure vis-a-vis Torres-Garcia, this time not in a Bargurian sense of the word, but in a literal sense of the word. And I think that his testimony will be priceless to conclude this encounter. So I'll invite Maria and then Luis, and then we'll have again a Q&A session with you all. Thank you.
Hi, is Hunter in the box? Because he said he'd, I'll try to do it myself, but I have to use my laptop for technical reasons. Oh, shoot. Thanks. Oh, wait. I have to bring it up, though, because I don't want people to see it. Luis, as he's just mentioned, asked me to say a few words this afternoon about the problem of constructivism, about its uses and abuses, which I'm honored to try to do in a very short amount of time. Obviously, I speak not as an expert of Latin American art, but nevertheless, I'm somebody who has written about constructivism as a concrete historical formation in Moscow in the early 20s, and also its afterlife in New York in the 1960s. Though long acknowledged as a major force in 20th century art, constructivism has also engendered its fair share of terminological confusion, not only at the time of its conception in the 1920s, but also under the impact of the Cold War, which gutted constructivism of its social and political stakes, turning it into an innocuous form of geometric abstraction. It is thus little wonder that confusion pertains or persists in the usage of the term constructivism in interpretations of Torres-García, as Luis notes in his catalogue essay. For example, Torres is quite often credited with having introduced, did I say Luis? Torres-García is quite often credited with having introduced constructivism to Latin America upon his return to Montevideo in 1934 after 43 years of peregrinations abroad. And he's thus sometimes described as the father of Latin American constructivism. Whatever the merits of such characterizations, which are for the experts here to debate, and also for the audience, it's important to note that these characterizations seem to be based not on any self-presentation by the artist himself as a constructivist, but rather on his persistent recourse to the adjective constructive, or the noun construction from around 1930 onwards. For example, constructive is how he most often describes his signature formal language, comprising the combination of a strong emphasis on compositional structure, usually rectilinear scaffolding, as you see here, with pictographic elements or schematic figures. He often includes constructive in titles for individual works, as you see in the exhibition, and in the names of various artist groups that he helped organize in the 1930s, and the word plays an outsized role in his pedagogy in the 40s. In 1944, he published a kind of summa of his aesthetic philosophy, Universalismo Constructivo, a compendium of essays offering an exposition of his, quote, general constructive theory and its relationship to the ancient tradition of the Americas, which was based on his study of structure in prehistory, antiquity, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the modern schools of art. Torres's primarily attributive use of the word constructive rather than the substantive constructivism has to do in the end with a serious philosophical endeavor on his part, namely to trace what he sees as a trans-historical force that persists through and thereby unifies the history of art from prehistory to the present. But precisely as such, his is a form of philosophical idealism that has nothing to do with constructivism as an historical formation, which was premised crucially on historical rupture, not continuity, and which it is my task here to describe. Let's now take a look then at constructivism as a historical of some of the others. Figure, in this case an ovoid shape, repeating it in a form of to form a regularly diminishing pattern. These lines were then cut with a saw and the ribs thus rotated, or the ribs move of almost a century now. These constructions register to us as aesthetic objects, but the constructivist himself regarded them as something like laboratory experiments or a form of research. By contrast, this photograph documents Rodchenko's shift to he called a productivist platform, which called for the constructivists to enter into the industrial production of objects for use in everyday life. To this end, Rodchenko refashioned himself as a design engineer, a realm for which he had no professional training whatsoever, only the hubris of his convictions. Pipe in mouth, he models the prototype of a pair of overalls of his own design, one of his first attempts to translate the geometric forms of his laboratory constructions into function-specific clothing for workers. Hung up behind him are the once hanging constructions now collapsed. Only by abolishing the putative autonomy of the work of art, Rodchenko and his fellow constructivists believed, could they play a role in the construction of the world's first workers' state. Compare this extraordinary photograph of Torres-García, we saw it in Jorge's talk earlier, dressed in overalls around exactly the same time, 1921 to be precise. His overalls were store-bought and painted by him for a costume ball hosted by the Society of Independent Artists here in New York, where he was living in the early 20s, as Jorge discussed. Their front and back sport a map of Manhattan delivered in his then current vibrationist futurist style, so that his costume body not only wears the city he inhabits, but also advertises his current pictorial practice like a roving sandwich board man. If you look carefully at the bottom of the photograph, you can see that he stands somewhat precariously on a wooden plank slung across the top of a bed, perhaps to help steady his body for the camera shot. But then, in the light of his own commentary on the difficulties he experienced in New York, few painting sales, the frustration of his attempts to turn his toy constructions into a livelihood for himself and his large family, it is hard not to read the tone of the photograph, for all its fun, as also one of deep pathos, as a portrait of the insecurity of the artist walking the plank under capital. The contrast between these two self-fashionings of what it meant or could mean to be an artist between the two world wars could not be more stark. But let's fast forward now to the big chestnut question of the reception of constructivism in Paris, where the cosmopolitan Torres arrived in 1926 and where, in the late 1920s and 30s, he developed his constructive language of form through, as the present exhibition demonstrates, a voraciously eclectic, those are Luis's words, dialogue with Cubism, neoplasticism, modernist primitivism, and the museological treasury of African, Oceanic, and eventually also pre-Columbian art that he found in that European city. I've purposely left constructivism out of this litany of modernist isms and other tendencies with which Torres jousted, however, for the simple reason that by the mid-1920s, or mid to late 1920s in Paris, constructivism, as a historical formation, had been to all intents and purposes fully re-aestheticized and absorbed into the much broader contemporaneous development of geometric abstraction. Multiple forces were at work in this process of re-aestheticization, but particular note should be made of the disingenuous role played by the expatriate Russian Antoine Pevsner. These examples of his sculptures in celluloid and brass from the late 20s, who had moved to Paris from Moscow in 1923. Pevsner had adamantly rejected the aesthetic and political platform of the Moscow constructivists, which was his right, of course, but once in Paris he proceeded to misrepresent his own sculptural production with all its relentless fetishism of metal and celluloid and slick industrial finishes as the true face of constructivism, thereby directly contributing to the massive confusion of terms that has characterized the history of constructivism that I mentioned at the outset. Torres would certainly have been acquainted with Pevsner. The expatriate Russian was a member of the anti-surrealist group that Torres co-founded, Cercle et Carré, which Estrella talked about a little bit, and he exhibited in its April 1930 exhibition. That said, I haven't yet found any evidence in the historical record that they, say, visited each other's studios or otherwise shared more than a professional acquaintance. This is in contrast to his documented social interactions with much more significant artists in Paris, like the Alps were mentioned, but many others. But more importantly, perhaps, than studio chit-chat, I don't see any evidence of a dialogue with Pevsner in Torres's work, at least not in what we find in the present exhibition upstairs. On the contrary, it is primarily with Cubism and Cubism's recourse to African masks and sculpture that Torres tussles in the immediate wake of his arrival, just after 1926. But it is clearly neoplasticism that poses the major challenge from the mid-1928 onwards, when Theo van Doesburg, the expatriate Dutch editor of the influential and long-running international magazine De Stijl, befriended him. An almost entire wall of the exhibition shows us, even before Torres came to his signature refutation of pure abstraction, how he jousted in a serious and sustained fashion with his friend Mondrian, unmaking, in work after work, the Dutch artist's extraordinary achievement of compositional equilibrium and subtle materiality. But as for a dialogue with constructivism, I just don't see it during the years of Torres's most direct encounter with modernism in Paris. What we do see, however, are lots and lots of constructions. This was a relatively new mode of sculptural assemblage in the West, most often credited to Picasso's vigorous dialogue with African and oceanic sculpture before the First World War, and now a kind of international vernacular to collapse the familiar opposition. An international vernacular among progressive artists of many stripes, including futurists, Dadaists like Schwitters, and yes, early constructivists like Tatlin. But the sheer number of constructions made by Torres, some 130 from the Paris years alone apparently, was a real revelation for me, especially since I had not seen the groundbreaking Houston show a few years ago that was dedicated to this aspect of his production. The present exhibition takes us through the trajectory of the artist's sculptural production, from the toys starting in the late teens and 1920s, to the rough and ready stage-like shadow box constructions, still lives in heterogeneous materials, to the incision, actually gouging, of the pale echo of a neoplastic grid into a single plane of wood, as if really wanting to as if he were really wanting to be making a stone wall, to its transposition into an abstract concrete hybrid whose outturned right foot here tells us that it's on the brink of walking away, to the elaborate modernist primitivist, at times abstract, at times concrete choreographies that he constructs in 1931 and afterwards. Looking at these constructions prompted two initial thoughts with which I'd like to close. The first is that the emphatic tactility of his woods, as he called these constructions, reminded me of nothing so much as the rough humility of many of Rodchenko's laboratory constructions. This is an archival photograph dating to 1924. This quality, this kind of humility that has been much obscured by the dozens and dozens of reconstructions of his spatial constructions that have been made since the 1960s, primarily under the sign of minimalism, such as these, which are all in metal with very high degrees of finish. Instead of trying to approximate the rough humility of the original constructions, which is probably impossible to do, these later reconstructions or replicas of Rodchenko's work, which is how we mostly get to see them, since the one upstairs is one of the only ones still in existence, These replicas offer slick, shiny, streamlined odes to the machine age that bears little resemblance to what the artist in fact made. The second thought has to do with Torres-Garcia's exploration of transformability and provisionality as sculptural principles. This is most explicit in the toys, of course, which are in their very essence committed to processes of disassembly and reassembly. But we also find it, perhaps, even in some of the totemic constructions, if you can call them that, such as this one from 1929, which I showed earlier, in which stacking is the basic operation at play. These are all separate pieces here. If this emphasis on transformability and provisionality might be seen as a contribution to participatory aesthetics today, avant le lettre, it must also be said that they are governing principles of a great deal of modernist sculpture, including laboratory constructivism, but equally Maliewicz's suprematist architectons, which are in fact accumulations of unpainted plaster cubes and parallelepipeds of various sizes and dimensions. All of these activities have a common inheritance of, to varying degrees, in a triad of phenomena in the new vernacular, the new international vernacular of constructed sculpture, in African and Oceanic precedents, and in, maybe most interestingly of all, the building blocks of Friedrich Froebel, the would-be architect, crystallographer, and legendary inventor of kindergarten, who proposed in the early 19th century that young children should first be educated through open-ended play with building blocks and other judiciously chosen materials, and only later in the verbal arts. Thank you.
Hi. This is called Growing Up with Style. And I'm the only non-scholar here, I want to warn. And it's somewhat autobiographical, which I don't like, in any case. I'm at a point of my life in which I made my complete peace with Torres-García. It took a long time. Growing up in an environment ruled by him was not easy, sometimes even painful. I never knew exactly if the gray and earth colors of the Montevideo in which I was raised were due to his paintings or if his palette was a consequence of the city. It didn't really matter which was first. In a country of immigrants, maybe it only was a sign of shared melancholy. A reference building in my neighborhood to give directions was the Green Building, which in its oddity expanded the limits of our imagination. During the 1950s, I was studying art and architecture at the same time. When I tried to design a colorful building, I was told that I had to respect the urban color context, keep its harmony, and that it wouldn't tolerate shrillness. We all knew that Torres also used Mondrian neoplasticist colors, somewhat muddled, and yet during my student time, his palette was always referred to as earth colors, which tolerantly also included black, white, and gray. When a teacher advised me to use a golden rule for architecture, my reaction was to declare, I am an artist and I don't use prosthetic devices. Though Le Corbusier's modular echoed Torres' much earlier pictograph symbol for the universal abstract man, nobody made the connection. Interestingly, Justino Serralta, a Uruguayan architect and my best teacher ever, had assisted Le Corbusier in the development of the modular. he was who drew the man for modular 2. In any case, at the time, I distrusted both Torres-García and Le Corbusier. In art school, I belonged to the rebellious student generation. The school was a bad copy of the French Academy of the 19th century, and we wanted to be contemporary. We worked on a curriculum that included ideas of Montessori, John Dewey, and Herbert Reed. We leaned towards the Bauhaus, particularly as represented by Itten and Klee. With dogmatic passion, we hated anything dogmatic and academic. Looking inside the school, we had our academic teachers, who we eventually managed to kick out. Looking outside the school, we had the Taller Torres-García. Everybody in the Taller followed the dogma. It consisted in drawing little symbols and using the earth colors. We saw this as a cult producing an empty style. Meanwhile, in our resentment, we continued to ignore not only the Mondrian colors, but also Torres's odd series of portraits of the late 30s and early 40s. These were weird. They were dangerous since they broke the dogma by escaping his own anonymous rule. The portraits might imply some of the freedom we refuse to acknowledge. Because of its focus on anonymous rule, this exhibit in MoMA doesn't include them either. Ignoring them, however, evades the question of how one could have abstraction and figuration coexist in the same person. It took hegemonic permission and Gerhard Richter to allow for that. But permission was granted to Richter. Worse for me, I actually liked these portraits Torres did. In my eyes, they looked like Daumier meeting El Greco. So going back to Torres and pedagogy, the Taller was our enemy no matter what, and I kept my little liking to myself. The Taller was the French Academy dressed in universal constructivist costume. When I came to New York in 1964, I had the privilege of painting the walls of Louise Nevelson's house. This time I went to see it because of chauvinism. And because of chauvinism, I was upset that he was given only 4 circles in the spiral. And I left with a sense of respect. It took me till 1992 with the exhibition of the Escuela del Sur in the Bronx Museum, organized by Mari Carmen Ramirez, to realize that the whole cult, not just Torres, had some power to reckon with. By now, I was far enough from my own dogma, and the fog had cleared. I accepted them all, the whole group, even if not equally. Torres was still the master. Fonseca was still the one able to take off without having to kill his father to do so. He became, in my view, the most important sculptor in Latin America of the second half of the 20th century. All this doesn't mean that I'm willing to leave everybody scot-free. The Taller was definitely a cult. Students had to conform, and their work was recognizable from a mile away. The appeal to be part of that school might have been what I take as a negative aspect. The recognition of a style ensured a certain level of results and precluded most of its members from finding their own way. And if they did, they found it nearly impossible to transcend the master. In that sense, they were living proof of a bad pedagogy. The teacher never became dispensable. The students never were able to fly on their own. Few people outside the Torres' circle read his sometimes difficult and Baroque writings. I wasn't one of them either. However, the theory gave some meat to his work, while its absence often left nothing more than painted surfaces. There were other consequences for which nobody is to blame directly. However, they are interesting from an anthropological point of view. The simplicity of the symbology employed by both Torres and his acolytes helped their formal success in Uruguay. The style trickled both sideways and downward. Sideways to other artists outside the circle, it did not exactly create external copycats. Yet, it validated the simplification of Torres' graph system. For many, ornament took over language. Colors remained muted in Uruguayan art for a long time, no matter what ism artists were working in. Furthermore, the already debatable mission to construct a continuous tradition with so-called pre-Columbian cultures became a license for superficiality. It produced light art. The lightness was particularly useful for survival during the state of siege and dictatorship period that spanned from 1969 to 1985. There were no waves allowed to be made, and no waves were made. The downward trickle, on the other hand, created a crafts industry that defined a recognizable Uruguayan brand for souvenirs. This is still reflected today in ashtrays, mate gourds, and textiles. If pictography was communicating something in the paintings, here it became only a skin. Somehow one might classify the Torres-García art stream into several levels. One is exemplified by Torres himself. He knew what he was talking or writing about, and he fully integrated his beliefs and his doubts into his work. Meanwhile, his close circle only half knew and half guessed. Members of the Taller only succeeded inasmuch as they were able to find some personal space to explore other things. Then there were the many that did not succeed, and yet they served as emissaries for the looks developed by the Taller. It's their work that ultimately landed in the ashtray aesthetic mentioned. It took the end of the dictatorship to allow for the discovery of color, the use of dissonance, and the exploration of down-to-earth issues beyond the superficial palette. To say this is not by any means a judgment. What Torres and the artists around him did was mostly apolitical and espousing the autonomy and purity of art. This was so even though the beliefs of the members were mostly placed on the left of the political spectrum. Uruguayan historian Gabriel Pelufo points out that Torres was more politicized than he would confess to, and that he would use the word ethics in place of the word politics when he passionately defended the Spanish Republic. He liked the hammer and the sickle as a heartfelt plastic contraption. With all of this in mind, one could say that Torres and his circle had managed the strange and heroic feat of becoming a cultural achievement rather than an artistic one. Torres was, after all, interested in a collective, transnational, and impersonal form of art. In spite of his wishes, the style remained national. Typically, the show in MoMA narrows this national cultural achievement back to individually made high art. In certain ways, one could say that's about time that Torres-García receives his personal and long-postponed international recognition. He has finally been knighted beyond national borders for his individual achievement. With the show, I now reach the level of loving his work. Particularly his small wooden assemblages have the touch of a hand I would like to shake. However, in other ways, a review of all these phenomena by and about him provide unending food for thought beyond art. Served on a platter, there are morsels that haven't yet been touched and merit another reviewing. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Maria and Luis, for these two enlightening talks. Maria's brilliant parcours throughout the notion of construction and constructivism, and not only that beautiful clarification about the roughness of early and lab constructivist sculptures that are much more closer to Torres than we would think if we judge by the generalization of that kind of innocuous constructivism that was established after Paris and Pevsner, etc. And I think that is a fascinating clarification, and I love the idea that you ended with returning to this notion of infancy somehow, the kindergarten quote and Malevich. And Luis, thank you for that beautiful testimony. I'm sorry, I know that you don't like to be autobiographical, but I think this gave us a golden moment, and I personally was very moved when Luis sent me a draft of what he was thinking, and then I was very moved today too. Open questions. I mean, the session for Q&A is open. Maybe you have questions. Otherwise, I think that, while you guys think of questions, I will rescue Faucillon from the first session and bring it back to this. We'll bring it to this one. I remember at some point in the Life of Forms, Faucillon, and also I'll make a comment on the portraits, which I think is right to the point, Luis's comment about the absence of those portraits in the exhibition. But at some point I remember, it's just a bad memory of that, but Faucillon in the Life of Forms is discussing glass windows, Gothic glass windows, and he talks about the process of formal experimentation in order to produce some models or some examples of Gothic glass windows that never produce continuity. He kind of draws a rhizomatic form into which experimentality would produce forms without continuity. And I think that is interesting for much of the history of constructivism, but for Torres too. The Torres that I prefer is the one who is looking for that is uncertain and that produces objects and forms without continuity. And then you have, and I don't know if that's, I have the vague recollection that Faucillon establishes that as a rule, which is a fascinating rule. It's experimentation does not become canonic by logic, but produces forms without continuity. But then for the portraits, and my team knows that we were back and forth with the portraits, back and forth in the checklist and out of the checklist, and in the checklist and out of the checklist, and because I happen to like them too. However, they are like an island, and I was afraid, and maybe that was my mistake, that they would not be understood within the argument that they wanted to produce in the exhibition. I think that even a retrospective exhibition is not an exhaustive exhibition. There is also a production of landscapes by Torres that is interesting, since very early on to the end of his career. And Niko was pointing out that these New York scenes painted in Montevideo in the 1940s. And however, the portraits, and maybe we brought an image of the. Could you project that? That's an example, and I purposely chose Chamberlain, Stalin, Hitler, and El Greco. These portraits, and we have at MoMA one of those, is Wagner. And when we look at Cecilia Torres' catalog raisonné, which, by the way, I continue to acknowledge that was an immensely important tool for us, that she was generous enough to provide us access to the catalog raisonné before it was published or launched, because it's online. You realize that in spite of some portraits that Torres produced throughout his career, 1939 is the year of portraits, and basically 1939, 1941. And when you think historically, it's the war. 1939 is a moment of crisis in the Western Hemisphere and in the world. And then he produces this series of effigies where there is the political virtue and the political vice and the models of art, and even everybody, men and women. And that's the way I interpret these portraits, Luis, is that they are an island that does not produce or does not manifest as a continuity. It's an island within the work. And I take on them, I have like a moral political perspective. I think what he produced is a gallery of portrait in the Baroque sense of the word, also in the Aristotelian sense of the word, is that he is dealing with political models and with political anti-models at a critical moment, including aesthetic and historical and art historical models. I mean, and I think I am probably the only one to think that Torres is not totally a Platonician, as they were, but that in his early training, philosophical training, Aristotle's weights, and that is the way, in the ethic, in Nicomachus' ethic in Aristotle, the virtue and the vice don't support theory; they are only singular and individual manifestations. So politics is Pericles and anti-politics is the other one. And I think this is this. But I agree with you, it's an exclusion. At the end, it was an exclusion. I mean, I decided not to include them.
I think it's more complex. I agree they're an island, but the figuration involved in it is not an island, and that's really the point. He was doing landscapes all along, and they are whatever you want to call them, post-impressionist or whatever, and they had an effect. The Ribeiro brothers, Anelo Hernandez, a lot of people that were formed in the Taller ended up pursuing that route and not the constructivist route. So even culturally, that
there is a relevance.
Ambiguity or ambivalence or eclecticism had an effect beyond himself. And I miss that. In that sense, the show, I feel, is selective to make one point rather than capturing him as a much more complex figure.
Indeed. I don't...
Sure. In a little bit, I was wondering about these paintings because they seem more like caricatures than portraits, which... I think it goes along with what you were saying about some kind of political statement or intervention. But more specifically, I I'm wondering about actually irony and travesty and humor in Torres-Garcia, because I don't know myself, but I think that here you see some of it. I think there are moments in the exhibition which come very close to kind of travesty.
Yeah.
In a positive, use that word sort of in a
I
positive
understand,
way. So
absolutely.
I'm wondering about that.
Well, I think there is an aspect to that. I mean, we were discussing with Estrella about that sense of humor that you might encounter in Torres, and I agree with you. There are some works by Torres that are at the edge of the seriousness of the forum.
Which ones?
Well, I see those even in the early books. There is this kind of little small boldness at the edge that almost transform them into the opposite of what they programmatically want to be. And that is fascinating. And then obviously the toys is a moment of a laboratory moment for that. But that continues, yeah, definitely. And they have they definitely bear that connotation. These portraits, and I take your point. I mean, absolutely agree that the presence of the continuity of figuration is something that is absolutely central in Torres, and I wanted to address that within the frame of the concrete and the abstract. I mean, taking the concrete as figuration and the presence of pictograms and signs and the iconographic presence, the presence of icons and symbols in his work. But you're right. It's you will see landscapes that he painted in Belgium in 1910, and then you will see landscapes painted in Montevideo in 1940. And if you are not an expert, they look that they were painted the same year. And that's also a fascinating aspect of Torres-Garcia, his ability to go back and forth within his own production. And this is something that also took hegemony and Richter to be accepted in the land of the canon. Yeah, I see a question over there and another question.
I was interested in the connection of the Bauhaus and the influence of clay. I believe Maria mentioned clay. I couldn't not feel clay a bit in seeing the show. Paul Klee.
I didn't mention clay in relation to Torres-Garcia, but in relation to the student movement that was opposing the activities of the Taller. That we were interested in pedagogy and open up pedagogy. So the pedagogical sketches of Klee were like a textbook for us. It had nothing to do with Torres's language. It had to do with our wish to fight any dogma and to open up the teaching and the learning to its maximum. And from that point of view, what the Taller was doing was creating another church similar to the French Academy, which was, therefore both were our enemies in that moment.
However, Luis, you are not the first person who has visited the exhibition and made the comment about, I mean, the question about clay. I mean, independently of that aspect, but also of biographical facts, maybe clay is a question here as a reference. And we recently acquired here at MoMA the portrait of Torres-Garcia by Barradas, which was a huge gap in our collection. And within the discussion, clay came up also vis-a-vis Barradas, and they were very close, Torres and Barradas. So I don't know if you have something. It's just an open question about clay. See another question over there.
So consider this question from a very naive amateur in the presence of all these scholars. But we've seen how as he traveled all over the Western Hemisphere and how he incorporated or appeared to incorporate the styles of the artists that he encountered in those places, like the Mondrian Even his paintings in New York seemed very much like some of the Ashcan school. So I guess my question is, in general, what I've gotten here is that this kind of incorporation and merging of styles is considered sort of a positive step towards coming up with something universal. But when is it that, and when is it where in some other artists it might be considered derivative and really a negative? So how do we make that distinction about whether he was being derivative or whether he really contributed something unique?
I think this is an important question, and it's something that art historians think about a lot. It's also a very sort of loaded question. There are a lot of sort of stakes about this that some of the other panelists will obviously want to talk about. But I just wanted to make one comment, which is the reason why I think that in certain aspects of his work in the 20s, it's not at all derivative. It's a sense of there's a kind of affective aspect of his production that transcends any sort of simple idea of eulogy. That is, there's a kind of challenge that's understood and accepted and met and then responded to. And that's what I look for in looking at work. And in his particular case, I really see it on that long wall. Well, it's divided by the doorway, but that all of those, taking down of like a neoplasticism, that it's not derivative. It's just so because they're not at all like Mondrian paintings or like neoplastic pictures. So they must be about something else, and that clues us into the fact that there's a kind of energy here and thoughtfulness, and I get that from the kind of effective value that's generated by the pictures. But I take the premise of your question. I think it's an important one, like how it is difficult to precisely define how do we see it not just as derivative and something more than that. The other thing I wanted to say is that I don't think, but other people may disagree, I don't think there's any idea here that this is presented as some model of how an artist should do his or her work. It's not, so in other words, it's not programmatic, what I was saying. It's more, I'm trying to be descriptive or analytical of what I see in the encounter with his work in particular. And I wouldn't suggest ever that an artist would need to, go through the motions of churning through the history of art. Although somebody like Malevich, in fact, did exactly that. He chronologically started with, he believed painting began with Impressionism, and in a short space of time, maybe 7 years, he painted all the way through the modernist canon in order to get to the point of suprematism, which was the end of all of what had come before. It was the next logical step. But that's particular to his actual practice. And I would say, completely different set of circumstances and so forth. I'm really looking at this was really, really thinking, and it's completely inspired by seeing these paintings together as a group. I would never really have thought about that until seeing that. And you mentioned the Ashcan school. I also think that that's totally true and accurate. And it just seems like here is a painter who can really take on this stuff that he's looking at and sort of give back as good as he gets. Like there's nothing sycophantic here. And so I think that you get that it's a kind of this sounds very vague, but it's in this sort of realm of affect that I find that. Anyway, those are my thoughts.
I think there are two parts to this. One, there's definitely a moment in which you have a signature style which you wouldn't compare to anybody else, so he's safe. The other one is that there are two ideologies working at the same time here. One is copyright and the other one is copyleft. Copyright is a capitalist approach that there's authorship, that somebody has to do it first and has to be honored because of being first, and the individual signature is rewarded by the market, and the earlier you are, the better you are, and the price goes up. Copyleft is the one that deals with culture as a collective movement. Whatever contribution belongs to everybody, and it really doesn't matter who does what, as long as there's some improvement in society. So I think you have to separate those two ideologies when you ask that question. The word derivative belongs to copyright, doesn't belong to copyleft. Plagiarism is iffy, and it's sort of in between. And you may be, from one point of view, against it, from the other one, not care. But at least I think you have to bear in mind when you ask that question that there are these two ideologies, and you have to assume responsibility in which ideology you're asking the question.
Thank you, Luis. This is an endless topic. I would say that all art is derivative. The problem is not if it is, or to what extent it is derivative and from what, but to what extent a work produces something within the context of derivations and drifts, which is its source. I think, and I totally agree with Luis when he points out that there is an ideological connotation to the use of this logic of derivativeness in our discussions, and more strikingly and in a more consequent way in the art world, what we call the art world. But and there is a series of anxieties about anxiety of influences, and that's another problem, and probably another ideology that has to do with romanticism and the ego, but the point is, what does a work do? What does a work produce? What is the difference, even the deformation that it produces within the context from which it comes? And I think not only when he produced his signature style, and as Luis says, he was safe throughout his career, Torres was taken, as Maria wonderfully described yesterday, that wall, a brutal take on Mondrian, in the best sense of the word brutal. He was producing differences, écarts, intervals of differences between what he was looking, what he was discussing or thinking, and what he was doing. And that's where, meaning and significance lays in those intervals. And I think that is very much the way I approach the work, and that's why the exhibition is mostly built upon groupings of works that transform themselves as a series. Any other question? Yes.
Yeah. What was the market for his work in the 1930s, the constructive pieces he was doing in Paris? Was this work gathered from European collections? Did he bring it all back to Uruguay with him? Did he have dealers in Paris? Do we know much about that?
We do. I frankly, I'm not specialist to address that question. He sold. I don't have the impression that he was very successful selling works. I have the impression that it was a moment in New York he was approached by important collectors, Catherine Dreyer, the Société Anonyme, Mrs. Whitney. And I have the impression that in Paris there was a moment, 31, 32. Maybe Cecilia, you might enlighten us with more specific, or Susanna, who they have been the authors of the Catalogue Raisonné, but I don't think, maybe I am wrong, that Torres was extremely successful selling works.
Then he had an impact here in the 1940s, an important impact here in New York in the 1940s through dealers and through the way artists knew about his work, and that is a fact. And Sidney Janis wanted to organize a show while he was still living, and then he organized it fairly soon after he passed, and we know that that show had an impact even on a very important artist in New York, but that's what I can say here. I mean, it's not an encyclopedic answer. Any other question? Cecilia, you want to add something about the market in Torres? Huh?
Paris, he exhibited in many galleries, in many avant-garde galleries, Pierre Loeb, Georges Petit, Galerie Sac, and modestly he sold, but very little. I mean, a great breakthrough was when Gallatin went to Paris and purchased a painting and then a sculpture that it's upstairs, both are upstairs in the exhibition. And he traveled with 2 American collectors. I think it was Morris and Hirschhorn, but Hirschhorn was not at that moment. Hirschhorn purchased after Torres-Garcia's death. And but overall, his livelihood was difficult. Yeah. And I would like to add a little thing about the Ashcan School.
Yeah.
Torres-Garcia, when he came to New York, and we can see that in the exhibition upstairs, the style that you could compare to the Ashcan was already, he was already doing it. There are 2 landscapes upstairs of 1919. So the theme of the city and the way that he did the city, in a way I find is more advanced than the way the Ashcan School was doing the city. Yeah.
Thank you, Cecilia. And also, you know, there is this interesting footnote in a text that was written by Cesar Paternoster, an important Argentinian artist, for a show that Cecilia organized on precisely the articulation and the intertwinement between pre-Columbian abstraction and Latin American abstraction, and he quotes the diaries of Sidney Janis, who organized that exhibition fairly soon after Torres passed. And so he said Barnett Newman would go every morning and spend the morning there looking at the works and explaining or trying to explain the symbols and the icons. And then I was having a couple of conversations with Robert Storr, who told me, well, Luis Bourgeois was very aware about Torres-Garcia in the 1940s and made work based on Torres-Garcia. So there is an impact in spite of the non-success of, let's say, his market. And I think that is what is relevant. Probably not. We can imagine what was the economy in Europe in the early 1930s after the crash. Yeah, that's true. It's not like Jeff Koons is a Any other question? Well, I think we have come to the end of this, and I thank you very much, you all. I enjoyed immensely and learned a lot. And then I thank you all for being generous and being here with us. Thank you.